Now, after the break, you're going to want to stay with us because we're talking about a worrying warning on climate change. A new report logs 2050 as the date for the end of human civilization if nothing is done. More on that when we return. Now, a new report on climate change sounds a grim warning for us all. It says human civilization could end by 2050 if nothing is done to stop the pace of global warming. Drought, famine, devastating floods could all result from a scenario where a 3 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures occur. That's all. Now, in 30 years, this could displace 1 billion people, causing the collapse of ecosystems and trigger a breakdown of international order. Now, according to Australian think tank, the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, these projections could take place by, we mentioned, 2050, unless concrete action is taken to curb greenhouse gas emissions. To compound the problem, a separate report shows carbon dioxide levels increasing by the second highest annual rise in the past 6 decades. Greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, trap heat, making temperature rise to unnatural levels, rather. Now, it is typically caused by human activities, including the burning of fossil fuels for electricity, heat, and transportation. Well, global business leaders, policymakers and experts in the field are currently in Singapore for Ecosperity Week. They're discussing the latest developments and driving action on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. One of the speakers, no stranger, Robert Swan, was the first to walk both the North and South Poles. His 900-mile journey to the South Pole stands as the longest unassisted walk ever made on Earth. During his Antarctic expeditions, he and his team survived near-death encounters as a result of premature melting of the oceanic ice. Well, for more insights and stories, we're joined by explorer Robert Swan, who, as we mentioned, is at the Ecosperity Week conference over at Marina Bay Sands. Robert, you know, we've just talked about the statistics behind global warming, but you really are the eyes on the ground. Tell us, how did the environment there look like when you went for the first time 30 years ago?
Well, let's be straight that Antarctica and the Arctic is mostly made of ice. And if ice is at 0 degrees Celsius, it'll be ice forever. And when I went there 30 years ago, yeah, it was beginning to change, that the climate was getting a bit warmer, but you really couldn't see an awful lot of change 30 years ago on what we saw. These places are beautiful. They're the last true pristine wildernesses left on Earth. And we've watched a lot of change over the last few years, I have to say.
Yeah, let's speak of some of those changes, because I'd just like to remind our audience, you've been there countless times, so you've been able to monitor this. And I believe there was one experience where that change almost led to a near-death encounter.
It did, and let's just, for our viewers and listeners, be clear. Antarctica is ice on land. The Arctic, the North Pole, is a frozen ocean of ice. And let me be clear in saying that 30 years ago, almost to the day, we reached the North Pole. And now, 30 years on, it is physically impossible to walk any longer to the North Pole. There is no ice during the summer months. Now, if people want to argue about whether climate change is happening, there is a very, very clear fact that the Arctic Ocean is telling us. And we see every year changes, not just at the North Pole, but at the South Pole, because, as I say, it's ice, it's melting, and it's affecting very much, or is affected by what's happening to our world. And before we go any further, I just want to say that, you know, your report, your thing about 2050 is quite tough news, is it not? And I think what's really important in this whole debate, that we are positive, especially for young people that are growing up today. It'd be rather depressing for them to see the year 2050 and think, what's the point in bothering? The whole world's going to end. We can't have that attitude. We need to be positive, and we need to be thinking clearly, as they are here during this week in Singapore, about solutions. The inconvenient truth time is over. We need to be thinking very clearly about what each of us can actually do.
Well, now that you've got this community gathering, what do you see then as your role in promoting this hope among the young people, as you mentioned earlier?
Well, I think what's important is you need good stories. And last year, my son Barney, who's 24 years of age, and myself, and I'm 62 now, we made a journey as father and son to the South Pole, only surviving on renewable energy. And that was a huge battle. I actually became injured on that journey. It was a really tough thing to do, but my son made it to the pole only on renewable energy. And there is a story, especially for young people, to see that you can make a difference, you can do things. And why I'm very proud to be here at the conference here for the week is because I think business and industry and governments are one thing, but also, as you've correctly said, we've got to get to young people at the same time. So I feel, in a small way, I'm bridging that gap with positive news. It cannot be just negative.
Right, and with this dramatic deadline that's been put to us, how do you think that's going to change the way that you explore and trek in the future to such terrains?
Well, obviously, you know, as I say, you can't walk to the North Pole. You'd have to be swimming at the moment. The North Pole is out. But for the South Pole, what's really interesting is that over 30-odd years, apart from what we see on the edge of the Antarctic, where ice is more melting, the wildlife is being affected, but even in the center of the continent, last year when we were walking across that surface, and I've spent over 100 days walking and pulling sleds across the surface of the Antarctic, even for me, I was looking down thinking this surface has changed. Things are changing down there, and I think it's important that when we make journeys, I'm making another journey at the end of this year back to the South Pole, again, only using renewable energy, trying to inspire young people, that yes, Antarctica's changing, the Arctic's changing, but we do need to be having great stories to inspire people. I think if it's too kind of these are the facts and this is what's going to happen, it doesn't work. We need to have that idea that people can, and it's not that hard to make changes themselves and feel proud of it.
Absolutely. Robert Swan, thank you for sharing your stories and your experience with us. Robert Swan, an explorer, just sharing with us some of his experiences. We didn't get to the story where his eye color changes once he gets into that region because of just the difficulty of the environment. Now, let's move on to